Now, I don't know about you, but the first time I picked up that poem and read it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, right? Is that not one of the most remarkable poems you've ever heard? Forget that he's a 9-year-old child. Isn't that just... Let me ask you a question. Has that child understood the concept of empathy, do you think? And how, right? Is that use of language not extraordinary? Now, my point is this. My opinion of that young teacher did not change. She was still a remarkably gifted, talented, extraordinary teacher. However, she had been trained and had experienced as a child herself a system of education that requires you to set very specific outcomes and only measure every achievement against those very specific outcomes. And because this was a failing school, she was under even more extreme pressure to focus on those specific outcomes. Now, what it strikes me about that, by the way, she sat down with myself after and she cried. Because as soon as she realized, and she had breathing space, she realized what had happened, not just for Clint, but the other children and her mindset as she was as a teacher. And I think the best way to sum it up is this. It strikes me that we have become so pressured around outcomes and about making sure that children achieve the measurable things they have to achieve, that somewhere along the line, across the world, education has forgotten one very crucial thing. And for me, it's this. Education and learning is about the quality of the journey. It's about the process. And what we need to understand is that if we get the journey right, if we make it irresistible, if we make it meaningful, if we fill it with passion, then outcomes will take care of themselves. But one of the things I urge every group of teachers I talk to is to remember that when we're talking about a future paradigm, a new model of learning, that we never ever allow ourselves again to design that system based on set outcomes. Because what that does is it creates a really narrow experience, doesn't it? And I think the greatest tragedy is this. Across the world, we're talking about the great environmental crisis. The squandering of nature's natural resources is one of the biggest global issues we face as humanity today. But do you know what? I think one day we're going to look back on the education system and say that there was a greater crisis. And that crisis was that for generations we squandered the world's greatest resource, human potential. Because actually, it strikes me that we have the most remarkable generations of children I think the world has ever created. And I think the problem is, because of the narrowness of the experience so many of them have in the education system, that unless they're academic, unless they're really, really intellectually academic and bright and they can pass these exams, how many children leave education thinking they're useless? How many children think they failed? Clint would have been one of those children, wouldn't he? Clint had been labeled as a child that lived on his own little planet, that never did what he was supposed to do, couldn't accomplish set tasks. How brilliant is that child? Wouldn't you love to have a Clint in your class? Wouldn't you love to have Clint thinking about the world's problems when he grows up and grows into adulthood and leadership? And isn't he exactly the kind of person I would want fighting for me to find the solutions to things like the giant environmental crisis of the world? And I think that one of the things that taught me that day was that actually education has lived in a world, although the world's changing so fast, we're under so much pressure as a profession that actually we don't really have time to breathe long enough to think about the big challenges. And what I mean by that is this. Education over the last 100 years has had many, many new initiatives, many new things brought in, new ideas. Every 2 days there's a new idea. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the issue, by the way, since England launched its national curriculum in 1988, 1989, the government alone have tried to make 700 strategic changes to the national curriculum in 20 years. 700. Right? So we're living in a world where teachers are constantly juggling with trying to put new ideas on top of a system that's already overloaded and already far too pressured. So what happens is these things just become initiatives that last for a few weeks, and then because the wheel's spinning so fast, they disappear. There's a wonderful story by a man called Price Pritchett. Price Pritchett is one of America's great gurus of organizational change. And he was sat one night in a motel room in northern Canada, reflecting on some work he'd been involved in. And he caught out of the corner of his eye a fly buzzing against a window pane. And he sat reflecting on this fly buzzing against this window pane. And you see, the thing was, the fly was doing what it had been genetically programmed to do. It had one target in its life. The fly's one target was to head for the light. That's what flies are programmed to. They have to just head for the light. Wherever the light is, that's what they have to do. So this fly was buzzing as hard as it could against this window pane, trying to achieve its goal. The irony, of course, of the fly's plight was that no matter how hard it was buzzing, it would never be able to buzz hard enough to break through the glass. But it couldn't be accused of not trying, not caring. It was doing everything it could in its power. But it could end up killing itself through sheer effort right there on the windowsill. However, if the fly had had the space and time to stop buzzing just long enough, it would have realized that in this same room, 10 feet away, there was an open door, which meant actually that within 10 seconds of flying time, this fly could have reached the outside world it had been seeking. And I think one of the great joys of a conference like this, and of the way it seems to me that Beacon House manages development, is it ensures that as a group of professionals, you have the space and time to stop buzzing. And what I would say to you is, as you continue your journey into the development of a future model of curriculum, please don't rush. Don't try and get there too quickly. Because the minute you try and implement a new system too quickly, it's just another initiative. And this is far, far too important. And this is about a paradigm shift. And paradigm shift takes years to accomplish. Years and generations. And what I mean by that is this, that those of us in this room today, those of you who are committing to really make this journey happen, to begin the process here, the truth is, many of you may well have retired by the time the fruits of your labors show real dividends. But that is not an opportunity, that's not a reason to try and do it quickly or not start the journey at all. What we're talking also about here, when we're talking about a future model of learning, is I believe if we're seriously going to shift education globally, we must move away from the idea that what we're going to do is replace an existing curriculum and model with another new fixed curriculum and model. Because of the nature of the way the world's turning at the moment, we can't create another model, because as soon as it's created, it'll be out of date. It strikes me that the future of education has to be organic. It has to be constantly evolving and changing, doesn't it? We have to constantly move forward. So we can't ever get to a point where we design something so fixed and inflexible that in 10 years' time we have to have another conference where we're saying, how do we now create learning for the future? See what I mean? The capacity has to be part of that paradigm shift, that we're constantly evolving. What I would hope is around the world 10, 20 years from now, we don't have any more conferences that are talking about what do we do to create a learning of the future, because it's constantly evolving itself. So events like this won't be necessary. But the key is time, real time, the realization and confidence as a profession to understand that this isn't something we can just put in place, design and implement in a few months or even a couple of years. That it's something that reflects Beacon House's own story, that it's organic, it's evolving, that every year, every week, you're opening up new tributaries and new opportunities. And actually, I don't know whether, reflecting on the 35 years ago, you knew this is what it would look like. My guess is you didn't. And that's because you engaged in a journey of discovery and genuine organic process. And I would say the same thing when people talk to me about what we achieved at Grange. They said, well, did you know exactly what it was going to look like when you started? And the answer is no. I had key principles. I knew what I wanted in terms of the principles, but I had no idea what it would end up being. And the other question people ask me is, so since you've left the school, has it changed? And my answer is always, I hope so. Because if actually it hasn't continued to evolve and change, then I didn't do my job properly as a leader of education. And I think the greatest challenge that faces us, and interestingly, I heard people talking about this yesterday, and the reason why we need to create a constantly evolving system is because of this rate of development in the world. And one of the key elements, of course, it's not all about technology, we have to be very careful, but one of the key levers for change in this world has become technology, hasn't it? I mean, 20 years ago, let's just reflect on this for a minute. So much of technology has become part of our daily lives we forget. 20 years ago, who knew mobile phones? Who knew that you'd never be actually off work? Who knew that somebody could contact you 24 hours a day? Interestingly, isn't it an insight and interesting? If I'd known that 20 years ago, if I had a mobile phone, it meant I'd never have a day off, I would have blown up the mobile phone factory.